Bonjour à tous.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this morning's working session for today's Symposium on Heritage. And today we're going to bring up a somewhat provocative topic that is entitled From Decline to Renewal, Cultural Heritage and Urban Regeneration. So we'll have various speakers who will do a short presentation, and then, and of course this will bring us some hope, because we will talk about decline, but we will really focus on regeneration. And so in the course of the presentations, you will be hearing about urban regeneration. So thank you again for your attention, and we will field questions after the 4 presentations. 3 will be in-person presentations, and then there'll be a 4th one that will be online, that'll be a virtual presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Mrs. Varavatura. Then we have Mr. Miguel Rivas. We also have Mr. Alix de la Guégonière. And online, we are pleased to welcome Mr. Branislav Antoník. We're going to start off with the first presentation, which brings up some of the challenges and opportunities in terms of preserving the cultural heritage, industrial cultural heritage after deindustrialization. And I'd now like to invite Mrs. Tura to the floor to give her presentation. Greetings.
Sorry, but I'm going to do my presentation in French. De mon côté, je voudrais remercier les organisateurs du colloque.
So I'd like to thank everybody for letting me introduce a part of my research. I'm going to talk about the challenges and opportunities in the preservation of industrial cultural heritage after the deindustrialization area. And we're going to focus on the Dock de Seine in Saint-Ouen. So research aims to understand how methods to value industrial cities by seeing how turning them into eco-neighborhoods and the features of this could be implemented at the level of the city. So we would like to see how cities have been reorganized and how to preserve historical cities and also collective memory. And this concerns the social groups that are targeted. And we're going to find the correlations. This interpreter would like to have somebody ask the speaker to slow down. Thank you. These are axes of renewal, and so we can identify axes in the renewal area of former industrial sites that I've kept for my research, and so we're going to have conservation as well as perspectives for the future development of deindustrialized cities. Methodology is going to be a descriptive analytical method, and we're going to talk about how to set up industrial sites in France and the consequences of deindustrialization in terms of organizing cities as well as reorganize industrial heritage sites in the context of sustainable urban development. And so we're going to focus on 2 particular areas, which include an documentary analysis based on historical data and maps that show the sites during the period of growth, the local industrial growth, and then we're going to have demographic growth between 1968 and 2017. We're going to also have an analysis of sites that's based on a detailed description of the sites as well as the evolution of their usages in the past. We're going to look at the actors and authorities that are involved in the process of patrimonialization. We're also going to look at actions that are conducted with the key players with open interviews. So here are the 2 axes of the renewal of the 2 former industrial sites for research. And I suggest that we start with the preservation of historical identity. In Nantes in the early 19th century, industry was the driver of local authority, replacing 18th century manufacturing activities. The end of the industrial era in Saint-Ouen took place in 1980. And this occurred with the closing of the shipyards. Then in the 1980s, the city of Nantes decided to requalify these areas. They wanted to promote different activities for these sites, which are based on new technologies while preserving the formal industrial buildings. So Île-de-Nantes city is a growing awareness of how we need to renew the city. And this is brought about by the acceptation and patrimonialization of the city. Preserving what exists is not the attitude of a nostalgic attitude of the past, but it's also based on development that is based on a more valued space. The requalification of public areas and the transformation of industrial buildings in order to give them new functions. This creates a new urban tissue for the development of the city. The history of Saint-Ouen is directly linked to that of the Duc de Seine. That's because the city became an industrial city thanks to the site on which have been implemented a railway in 1856. The end of the industrial period for the city took place in the 1980s, even though certain industrial activities continued to occur on the site. During the industrial era, the most significant activities were energy production and electricity. There was an opportunity to redevelop the docks, which began in 2003, but it wasn't until 2007 and the creation of the ZAC de Dock, a special development area, that the project began. And this is when an eco-industrial park was created. And so this area is intended to become a leisure area, and it is also surrounded by a natural landscape. So the neighborhood has been enriched by public spaces, residential area, and commercial and leisure areas in order to increase the attractiveness of this site. So since the beginning of the 1990s, there's been development of there's been the involvement of local associations of former industrial workers, of local politicians and scholars in the first design team, and their goal is to preserve the local heritage sites. This commitment has brought to a preservation of the industrial buildings by renovating former industrial buildings. It also has led to publications and exhibits regarding the working and living conditions of former industrial workers. Discussions between researchers, inhabitants, and local officials have played a key role in the first maps for renewing these sites because they identified various industrial sites, for example, the foundry site. So since the beginning of the project in 2005, there's been a strong commitment on the part of local enterprises, inhabitants, associations, local politicians, and historians working at the Department of Cultural Heritage of Seine-Saint-Denis in terms of preserving the local industrial culture. Several policies have been implemented, such as the rehabilitation of former industrial buildings and publishing books. In parallel to this, there's also been the integration of the gardens of former industrial workers in the district's renewal plans. Regarding the second axis of research, here the outlook for future development of industrialized cities. Based on the interviews that I conducted in Nantes, indicate that financing of the project for the Île-de-Nantes by European unions has enabled the three teams to be able to experiment and offer up new territorial policies for the renewal of the sites. These policies include the creation of eco-neighborhoods, citizen engagement, and in terms of design, for creating neighborhoods, as well as social and economic growth. After several years of recession, thanks to the creation of an research institute and of industries and industrial museums, this transition towards a new model of economic development is also reflected by an increase in the city's population. And if we look at Saint-Ouen now, so here we're talking about the Dock de Seine that have been listed in the program of the French Ministry of the Environment for the creation of eco-quartiers, eco-neighborhoods, whereby there's been experimentation with new territorial policies. Dock de Seine is now part of the Grand Paris, Greater Paris project. And this has brought about a new territorial policy. And there's also been citizen engagement in terms of designing these neighborhoods. In addition to this, there's been economic growth of the neighborhoods with the creation of an energy hub, as well as guided tours of the local industrial monuments. The transition towards a new economic model was also brought about, as in the first case studied, an increase in the city's population. So in Nantes, there's been a new economic development based, and this has brought new inhabitants to the city. So there's an annual increase of 10% of the population, and this occurred between 1990 and 2000, and 8% between 2001 and 2010. Another thing that we should underscore is that there's also been an increase in the diversity of jobs and an increase in blue-collar workers. In the case of Saint-Ouen, the new economic model based on commercial activities has brought about also new inhabitants to settle in the Duc de Seine area. There's been a significant increase between 2012 and 2017, and there's also something else that we should underscore is the number of certain jobs and the decrease of blue-collar workers between 2014 and 2019. Case studies indicate that the involvement of local players in the urban renewal projects could bring about a new model in terms of architecture and urbanization based on the needs of the inhabitants in order to preserve the past, industrial past. We also need to underscore the various urban renewal policies used in the context of these cases, which help us understand the transformation of French deindustrialized cities. In Nantes, we see a deindustrialization brings about a participatory policy and also a policy to preserve the city. Whereas at Saint-Ouen, this is a urban renewal project, which is part of a national policy in order to create eco-quartier. The final conclusion of my research is that the goal of economic development and social of the former industrialized cities could lead to a sustainable development model that brings in creative industries and industrial industries by using former industrial buildings. Thank you for your attention. And again, the interpreter apologizes, but the speaker was reading extremely fast. Thank you.
Très bien. Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madame Chora, for those two very explicit examples. Next speaker, coming from Spain, Mr. Miguel Rivas from the Tasso Group, and he will be giving us a presentation on development and urban regeneration, renovation as well.
Thank you very much, you all, for staying here in this discussion about how to maximize the role of cultural heritage in urban development and urban regeneration. So this is basically a discussion not about preservation. It's not about conservation, exactly. It's more about valorization. So how to address heritage in a way to build the future. Okay, so this is the story of 8 small and mid-sized cities across Europe who are collaborating in order to test a new approach, a more integrated approach, in order to make the most of heritage as a concept and as a reality, in order to tackle very different problems, because all those 8 cities are tackling very different problems, very different challenges related to urban development, not exactly urban regeneration, but they are in common that they lack a relevant, more integrated approach in order to deal with heritage, or in order to deal with the heritage fields nowadays. So that this is the purpose of a network of cities called Kairos. It's a Greek word meaning the right moment, meaning the timely moment to get into action planning with regard urban regeneration oriented to the cultural heritage valorization. Well, it's very important, first of all, to have a clear assumption of a couple of basic things, basic facts happening in the heritage field over the past, let's say, 2 decades. The first main change is about a change of scale. This is commonly assumed that this is not only about the single building. This is not about the monumental artifact only. Okay, this is a new interest on the urban setting, on the urban fabrics with heritage value. Okay, to be considered as well as a subject of the heritage field. The second main challenge, which is in my view much more important, is that nowadays it's not only about preservation, but valorization matters as much as the preservation or the conservation issue. But that's very important because more than just a stock of the past, heritage is now addressed as a history of transition and should be managed as such, as a sequence of different layers over history. So such a dynamic approach or transitional approach address heritage as a living memory, so valuable to build the future. And this idea fully fits with the idea of circularity. It's like reuse the past to build the future. So this fully fits with the idea of circularity and sustainable urban development. Both major changes have led also to a change of method, because in order to fully embrace the multifaceted nature of heritage valorization within, and that's very important, within the complexity of today's urban space, so an integrated approach is needed more than ever. But what kind of integrated approach? An integrated approach not just for research. This is not about an academic work of a style of doing things. This is a real action planning. So what integrated approach we would need? So that has been the main challenge of this network of medium-sized cities across Europe. They have built up, and I am now here representing them as the lead expert of the network. We have spent 2 years in a kind of research action exercise. So while addressing real urban problems of a different kind, we have been building up this kind of 5-pillar model. So this is we have no time to go into details to each of those 5 pillars. Probably the space, for example, the space pillar is all related to the kind of urban planning, the kind of urban design, or the catalog of the new smart and neutral carbon urban solution over the urban fabrics with some heritage value. So probably the space should be at the core of this integrated approach, but it's not enough, okay? That's why these pillars regarding social cohesion, regarding all the economic elements, regarding attractiveness, which is a powerful concept, not only related to the need of building up or rebuilding up the local identities, but also with a kind of attractivity aim in order to build up more bolder, more competitive, more appealing, more compelling, updated local identities using heritage, of course, as a main foundation for that. So maybe the main question for the heritage field and for the heritage people is to what extent a heritage can give content and precise response to each of those pillars. So this is the way those cities has been experimenting with this integrated approach to solve many different local circumstances and many different local needs. This is just an example. For example, this is Shibeni, it's north of the Split, at the Croatian seashore. So they are using this model to challenge the revitalization of the old town, which is an impressive Venetian style old quarter, which is experimenting the population, touristic drive and gentrification, and lack of vitality during the low season. You know, it's like a ghost city in winter time, which is very challenging from the integrated urban planning point of view. This is a very completely different challenge. This is Heraklion, the capital of Crete. And this is Achia Triada. It's a historic quarter from a medieval origin with a strong Ottoman character in the urban layout, no, which is a prototypical problem of urban dereliction, also affected by the population, even with social conflict in the city. So urban planning is not enough to make a change on those things. The conventional heritage approach, which focuses more on preservation, is not enough to give new life to these historic districts. That is the idea, how to develop a new, more integrated approach. Another completely different local challenge. The picture is inside the Malbork Teutonic Castle. Probably this is the most visited touristic attraction in Poland. But they are not very happy in the city with this massive inflow of tourists who just came into the city, go to the castle and leave the city with little impact on the local economy. So it's clear that they need to develop a broader conception about what cultural heritage is for them. So they need a bolder city perspective to cultural heritage, okay? Another completely different example, which is not about urban regeneration, and it is not located into the historical downtown. This is Cesena, it's near close to Bologna. In Emilia-Romagna, it's a prosperous city. They have a significant background using heritage as a driver for urban revitalization, but inside the historical downtown. So the new step they are taking now is making the most of that background, working over the historical downtown to develop new areas in the city, but with some foundation on history, more than history, in this case, with some foundation on the industrial legacy. But the industrial legacy, in this case, from the physical point of view, is very small. It's like a ruin. So more than industrial legacy, it's like the industrial memory. It's simply about memory, the collective memory of the city. So the collective memory can be also useful and valuable and instrumental for area redevelopment projects in the city. In that case, in a part of the city outside the historical center. And this is the last example. Roskilde is within the Copenhagen metropolitan area. So they are just, it's a prototypical heritage adapted reuse project. It's a huge psychiatric hospital from the 19th century. And they are going to reuse all that complex to develop a new neighborhood in the city, in the outskirts of the city. So all those cities have in common their willingness to test and develop a new integrated approach using heritage as a driver for that. So I would conclude my presentation just for two questions for you to think about them, maybe now or in the future. The first is about, I would be curious to get to know what's your understanding about the concept of heritage-led or heritage center or heritage-driven urban development and regeneration. So I'd be very curious a discussion about that. And the second question is, are you really working with a sound and explicit integrated approach for your action planning? This is not about research. For your action planning in the heritage city? And if so, what's the room for improvement? So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. I think the two questions are very important, and I think each people in the room can have some questions. So we'll discuss about that at the end of the session. Voilà. Alors,
So now for the third presentation, we have Alix de la Guégonière from École Normale Supérieure in Paris, the ENS. And Monsieur de la Guégonière is also going to talk about post-growth heritage. He's going to focus on small cities that are in decline, and he's going to utilize them as laboratories for experimenting with new heritage management. So I'd like to invite Mr. Alix de la Guégonière up to the podium to give us his presentation.
Eh bien, je vous remercie.
Thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you for attending today's session to listen to me. I will be talking about one of the research projects that I'm currently conducting regarding the evolution of small urban centers in post-industrial France. So in just 10 minutes, I'm going to have to recap research that's been going on for numerous years. So, of course, if you have questions or if you'd like to have more details on certain aspects of my presentations, feel free to come up to me, or to ask them, rather, when we will have a discussion regarding these presentations. So this research is based on a relatively simple observation. I think that many of us have gone to the historical downtown of certain cities and noticed that here in France there are no more stores, and that the buildings are often worn down. And this is something that we find shocking, because we tend to think here in France that buildings have a symbolic role in the economic and social status of inhabitants. And it's interesting, thus, to look at heritage sites in cities that are in decline. So, of course, in France, there are systems in place to protect cultural heritage. So there is something that's called the protection of remarkable heritage sites. But in parallel to this, there's an increasing number of territories in decline. This means that decision makers often make decisions that are not well adapted. So I based my project on semi-directive interviews as well as an analysis of existing literature. But I also conducted a quantitative analysis at the local and national level. So the number of historical centers that are listed under the specific SPR rule has been decreasing. So the number of historical cities makes up about 52% currently of the total sampling of the 682 listed historical centers. So that means that 1 out of 2 historical centers is experiencing a decline. And this means that there are fewer people inhabiting these city centers. And this is challenging because protecting heritage buildings in France relies greatly on funding for protection that is based on tax incentives. And so due to this increase in the number of city centers in decline, this calls into question the policies that are in place. Currently, urban heritage sites have a key role in terms of economic production, rather. So to better understand the mechanisms that are in place at the local level, I focused on 2 case studies. So first of all, there's the city of Thiers and the city of Villefranche. And these are the 2 historical centers that have the largest amount of empty buildings in France. And they are also listed under the RSP law, the Remarkable Protected Sites Law, RSP. So in Thiers and Villefranche have different demographic growth. So Villefranche is a rural area that's been experiencing a decline in population since the end of the 19th century due to people moving to cities. Whereas in Thiers, the population has been relatively stable. It did increase a little bit up until 1982, after which the population has been decreasing by 6%, or has decreased by 6%. So for the past 40 years, the city, actually, here we're talking about Villefranche, where the municipality has been, number of people in the municipality has been declining. Now, let's talk about Thiers, which has experienced demographic stability thanks to its industrial nature. This is where knives are manufactured in France. But this area of production has experienced some decrease. And so for the past 40 years, there's been a population decrease of about 25%. And so about 1/4 of the population has left the city of Thiers. So at the local level in Villefranche and in Thiers, the historical centers have experienced an outsourcing of functions that are normally associated with downtown areas. So it's not really the development of commercial areas in the suburbs that has brought about this decline. Rather, it is a much lengthier process that began in the 1950s due to the application of urban theories derived from modern architecture conferences, which aimed to promote an anti-urban system that was based on disaggregation of the city and dividing it up into various sectors of activity. And so when at the end of the war, Second World War, it was important to have industrial areas. So as of 1964, industrial areas were built at the periphery of cities. So this all continued in Villefranche and Thiers up until the 1980s. Next thing that was outsourced is housing. In the 1960s and in 1970s, there has been a massification of housing, which was promoted by local plans, and the production of new housing was brought about the decentralization of the 1980s. So the municipalities were tasked with building new housing, and so they devastated their territories by building single homes. So there's also roads that have been built around the cities in order to have better traffic conditions. And so these bypass roads, these ring roads, has actually amplified the marginalization of historical cities. And in addition, it has also promoted the creation of shopping centers outside of cities. In the beginning, this was just a nascent trend, and in Villefranche, the shopping centers experienced a greater development as of the year 2000. So the decentralization by the French state also led to decrease in the endowments provided by the French state to the municipalities. Therefore, the municipalities, in order to increase their industrial, residential, and economic developments, they had to do this by increasing professional taxes and housing taxes. In addition, as of the year 2000, the French state also promoted a decrease in public services that used to be in the city centers. So the current crisis is the outcome of a marginalization effect that began 60 years ago. So now the French state is focusing on metropolises, and due to this, smaller cities are trying to make the best of it, and they're trying to develop heritage marketing strategies, and they're more or less conscious. And the goal here is to promote via heritage an image of the city which would conduct hypothetical visitors, encourage them to invest or live in the city. And the targets are families, tourists, British people, that is to say wealthy people, who, unlike local populations, which are often quite poor, the target audiences have means and can maintain the buildings. So this is no longer seen as a common good that should be preserved, but rather a resource that is in the territory that can be leveraged for economic means. And so they also utilize various tools to achieve this. Some are taxation tools, but sometimes they create special labels. So a label that is familiar to people here in France is Action Cœur de Ville, so city center action, Action Cœur de Ville. Now I'm going to talk about the interviews that were conducted in situ, as well as the analyses that I performed. And this reveals a change in terms of the heritage paradigm. It seems obvious that traditional protection tools are not efficient in order to protect territories that are experiencing a decline. Of course, tax incentives work in major cities or like Paris, or even in medium-sized cities, but this is not the case in areas in which real estate market is not thriving. And the practices used for urban renewal in the 1970s also focused too much on building and not on the social fabric. So the local players, the local stakeholders are increasingly questioning the role of experts, the so-called heritage experts, notably the architecte de France, the architect of France. So there's a social and physical dimension, and the local players are trying to set up a standardized product, and this is aimed at a certain target audience. So by way of conclusion, looking at these small cities enables us to look at the evolution of our society and its connection to the past. So it's also about a capitalism of enrichment, and where a financialized economy such as ours tries to leverage all sorts of different heritage sites. So it's important for us to examine what type of relationship we seek with our past. So rather than renewing tools that have not been efficient, the French state is really conducting a commodification of heritage buildings. but preservation rather is something that could help preserve our productive system. And so that's it for now. Thank you for listening to me.
Merci. Merci pour ces deux exemples.
Thank you very much for these examples in France. And it's, I would say, almost not surprising that you chose cities from the Massif Central area, where we're seeing a lot of population movement there. So yes, those are points where we do see things taking place, where the demonstration of the outflow of people there, when people tend to know that their cities are mentioned as a declining population cities. Let's go on with the fourth presentation then. This is a cities in decline, and leaving from France now to Serbia. So Mr. Branislav Antonic, who's going to talk to us about city museums, museum cities. There were examples where we can model, manage cultural heritage following growth. So you can go ahead and start.
Mr. Antonic, you can begin your presentation, please.
You can begin your presentation. Can you hear us? You can go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Hello, my name is Branislav Antonic. I'm from University of Belgrade, and I'm next please. Okay, I will present this micro-museum quarter in Sombor, one of shrinking cities of middle size in Serbia. You can see my co-authors. We are all from University of Belgrade Faculty of Architecture. Please, next. So this is introduction. I will just be very fast. Urban shrinkage and heritage management. Please, next. So we have already heard that the urban shrinkage is very problem of Europe, and it is especially important for Eastern Europe post-socialist countries, where almost 80–90% of the cities and towns are shrinking. And we need to develop strategies how to deal with this. Please, next. We have examples about cultural heritage used in shrinking cities, mostly in the case of bigger cities with shrinking patterns. The problem is actually that usually these kind of cities, shrinking cities, has pretty weak capacities to deal with it. And actually the position of heritage is different. In growing cities, we're thinking about how to accelerate urban growth through urban regeneration, through use of heritage. But in shrinking cities, we need, next slide, we need to form first some kind of magnet or positive interpretation of heritage to be appropriately promoted. So this is actually Bilbao effect, well-known example in Europe. So please, next. In the case of this paper, I will present the Micro-Museum of Sombor in northwestern Serbia. Actually, it is a bit bottom-up project developed from the local level and still, let's say, connected with national level. And why this paper, why this research is important? There are two general aims. One is theoretical. There is no discussion about, there is not enough discussion about how this concept like museum quarter can be customized to micro scale and then practical to present this such example in this case of the city of the Sombor. Please, next. So methodology is based on on two levels. One is already presented shrinking cities as a topic. The second one, how the concept museum quarters or districts can be implemented. So we'll develop, we'll present actually these theories and derived criteria, which we'll use to check this micro district in Sombre. Please, next. So next again. What is the point? Point is actually that we have this concept about Museum Quarter. The relatively small amount of cities is promoted with Museum Quarters, and most of them are not most of them. All of them are actually big cities. There are also some similar concepts like museum districts, museum culture quarters, creative quarters, and so on. Next. If you want to define museum quarters in cities, there are 5 points. Famous or regionally famous museums located in valuable buildings, in inner course, so heritage ambience. Then accessibility needs to be very, let's say, high quality. And finally, open urban space is also important to be a linking element between these buildings. So this phenomenon is still pretty rare across the world. Next. One well-known example, Museum Quarter from Vienna. Okay, big city. Next. After checking and researching these 2 theoretical fundamentals about shrinking cities and about museum quarters, we derived 10 criteria to be checked on this case study from Serbia. Next. So urban context is Sombre. Next. This is the city on the northwestern corner of Serbia, close to borders. So it is also a borderland city, a sort of borderland city. City is the best preserved middle-sized city in Serbia, although it is also one of the fastest shrinking cities in Serbia, as it was, let's say, with the problem of borderland position and far away from the main development centers. Next. City has a really rich history, especially during Habsburg era, Habsburg Empire, and it was also a huge administrative seat with many monumental buildings left for, let's say, to that preservation like this. You can see now all of them. Then next. You can see now the city structure. City is almost, let's say, preserved like it was 100 years ago. And now please next several times. So you can see the urban structure basically, which is a bit different. You have this Market Street, then next you have the main square, next 2 quarters, Orthodox or former Orthodox from Habsburg era with church and Roman Catholic. And this duality is typical for Southern Pannonian cities in Southern Hungary, Serbia, Northern Serbia, and Romania. And then this historic quarter surrounded by this boulevard. And finally, the district building or Župania, which is one of the largest historic buildings in Serbia. So the next. So the city is also really, let's say, has many nice open public spaces and urban greenery. The city is very famous by this urban greenery in Serbia. However, many of these buildings are empty or half empty. So the next. Then intangible heritage. This is maybe interesting for the French people, French scientists. This is the best preserved manufacture of jacquard looms developed in Lyon 200 years ago. This is the only working manufacturer from this loom, with these looms still working, and these looms are older than, are approximately 150 years old. And this is a damask silk production, one of the rare examples in Europe and worldwide, located next to the city. So next. So this is the district, which is in the western part of the city. What is important, it was almost neglected during 20th century, and now in the last 10, 20 years, it started mostly architectural refurbishment of certain buildings, like these buildings which are linked with German heritage. So the next. This is one of the recently revived squares. It was former parking space. What I want to point, it is not just to refurbish buildings to look like it was, let's say 100 years ago. It is also to add some new elements in some niches which are not so exposed, like to add some new contemporary elements like on the right image. Next. So this is the concept. This is the core of this research, to realize that we can form a museum quarter in the small city and micro scale. It is important to address that. You can see the buildings, the buildings on the upper part. So several museums, some of them are thematically oriented, like one is the building of the most famous painter from early 20th century in Serbia. Some of them are pretty general, like the city library, city gallery, or National Museum. But what is also important, this middle part with this new pedestrian zone. So we have this linking element which is developed and which is used as one entity. And slowly this pedestrian zone start to somehow to include other elements of creative industry and small enterprises and so on. So the next. So if you want to check, on the right, you can see the preservation level of the buildings, and this part it's really valuable. So these buildings are preserved and they are under state protection. We are now entering the second phase. We are trying somehow to brand this part of the city. It is important also to develop further this museum quarter with new creative elements, to add creative hub, and to develop hospitality sector and to develop culture tourism, because the city is very close to the Danube, which is a major tourist route in Europe currently, and it is fast developing. So the next. So if you want to check the 10 criteria, we put these three options to criteria satisfied, partly satisfied, or not satisfied. Next. This is, let's say, the summary of the research. These 10 criteria, half of them are actually already fulfilled. 4 of them are, let's say, partly fulfilled, and only which is still missing is the last one. Actually, this is the element of private-public partnership. This is still a public project, so supported mostly from local authorities and local level. And the next phase is to involve SMEs, and that small creative sector to be better involved. So next. Conclusion. We need, what is the point? We have many these concepts like this cultural-led urban renewal, and all of them really well established, but most of them are not developed or not customized to small cities, especially small and middle-sized cities with shrinking patterns. So we need to, let's say, somehow to add literature, add resources, add new knowledge about how to develop the constraints of small cities. So probably one of the approaches is to be rational and to be focused on pilot projects like micro format, museum quarters, creative quarters, and so on. So the next. On the example of Sombor, we can see all this in the macrocosm. So we can see potentials, problems, dilemmas. We need also to realize that projects maybe in these cities, because of weak capacities, should be started as publicly run, but then they need to include also the other sectors, NGOs, SMS, small in the culture and creative industries and so on. So it is important to make this connection, especially in the second level. Next. So for the future, we need to address these issues. Of course, we need also to support marketization, branding of small and medium-sized cities, because they're also usually, this focus on them is missing, and we need somehow to develop these kind of marketing strategies to promote them in the best way. We are almost there. Next slide. I just want to say that this is also related with two international projects, pan-European projects, Erasmus Plus and Interreg, which are dealing about shrinking cities along the Danube. And we, team from the Belgrade University, we are working on the atlas of Danubian cities in this project. So next slide. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Antonic. Je pense que nous avons quelques minutes.
I think we've got a few moments for questions, if we have some out there in the audience. please use the mic so everyone can hear. Hello, I'm an architect here in France. 2 questions and comments. When you talk about the decline in these cities, is it only based on population, number of inhabitants, or do you take anything else into consideration? And then secondly, on the neighborhoods, the districts, and the museums that we just saw, I understood that, in fact, it was making several small museums in several buildings in the same places. In, say, smaller towns and cities, personally, I live in Hoche. We have 20,000. Population is 20,000. When we do something like that, we can produce good quality installations, getting funding, having knowledge, and having the expertise. But then the problem is keeping them going, the functioning, as it were. So the investment is actually not the biggest problem. It's functioning operations afterwards. We just don't have enough people to open the doors and watch over the artworks. I think that's a question for all 3 of you, because you all referred to that, talking about the movement of people, populations. Well, if I might address the issue of post-growth quickly. You have the whole concept on urban degrowth or territorial degrowth. It's something much more complex. I would say generally studies look at demographics because that's what's the best documented with the available sources. And that's generally a good indicator. But of course, there's not only a population movement. There's the most common definition, though, is to say that degrowth or decline is a process. It's a territorial process which changes the demographic balance. So generally, territories that are in decline or depopulation, you have an increase of unemployment and impoverishment of the local inhabitants. So there's job loss, industry loss, and so on. So it's much more global, much more complex than just population. But my data was demographic based only. But clearly, there's much more to be taken into account.
Même si je me suis focalisée plutôt sur les données démographiques, il faut vous dire que le concept de la ville...
I was focused on demographics, but when we say shrinking cities in English, there's differences across countries, of course, but the population loss is not everything. If you look at that across other European countries, the sense of the decline, it can be economic activity, a social decline. But at any rate, for my presentation, I was focused on demographics. How to go from this demographic population decline to a new development model that would be more sustainable socially and economically. Right. Any other questions or comments? Please, can we get a mic over there? Hello, I'm a writer for the Journal des Arts. And all the presentations, there's the idea of attractiveness. So today in urban planning, the idea of attractiveness is actually being questioned. And so for those of you present here and those of you people working in the area already, the example of, say, Albi, which is, there's been a lot of focus on its cultural heritage, You realize that the contribution of it being registered on the UNESCO list, it's a bit similar as to what was said about in Poland. There's a passage of the church that people come in, stay 24 hours, and then leave. There's no real economic impact. So in Albi, in fact, what allowed for the preservation was, in fact, the socialization of it. There were investors, and then there was downtown housing. So these preservation policies of heritage that tend to stop degrowth, should they not be focusing more on the local inhabitants and local activities as opposed to just a tourist attractiveness or second housing or secondary home for vacation residents? Would you like to say something, Mr. Rivas?
You hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
It's a very good question. We have consciously used the word attractiveness instead of marketing, instead of communication, for a couple of reasons. But one of them is that a conventional destination market, or the most common way in which heritage is addressed from the marketing field, from the city marketing field, is just constraints to the visitor economy. It's just constraints targeting tourists and visitors. This is a limitation because we need to reframe heritage within the market. When I say marketing, I prefer talk about positioning. So it's not about it's about how is the place of my city in my regional context, in my national context, or in my international context. And heritage has much to say in this field, but in a more integrated manner. It's not about just targeting visitors and tourists. It's also targeting the local population, investment, local innovators, and so on. So we need a broader conception about what can be the role of cultural heritage in the city marketing field. Because nowadays it's much more focused on the touristic marketing. It's like a tourist asset, much more than an asset that can be functional and valuable to a number of different fields, or other than the visitor economy sector. That is why we have created, out of the 5 pillars in our integrated approach, was consciously devoted to attractiveness. But it's not about tourism. Is not about touristic marketing. It's a more comprehensive approach. And attractiveness is very important because all cities is about positioning.
Alors, moi, je pense que je vais avoir un avis un peu.
My opinion might be a bit more nuanced because I think your question is based on two things. Both scientific, as regards to marketing, territorial strategy, and city positioning. But scientifically, it's quite complicated to know today what the real impact of these strategies is. So scientifically speaking, it's hard to say you can either for or against. You just have to study the phenomenon, the issues, and see over the long term if there is a benefit. So the end of your question, though, was more a policy perspective. So politically, I might say, thinking about the benefits, the joint benefits of our societies. Well, I think that relatively, you have to understand that all of the vocabulary based on attractiveness depends on the metropolitization of our city policies. But these models are included in how city policy is rolled out, I think, but it's, say, less scientific than political. I think it's hard for cities to integrate those policies because if a policy is for a 12 million city, 12 million population, 12 million cannot be adjusted to a 2,000 population town in the countryside. Then you have to look at the role of the state in all of that. That's what I was starting to mention regarding population decline. So all this vocabulary translates the fact that the state is pulling out completely and starting to promote a sort of urban Darwinism, where small cities or cities, be they big or small, if they can't draw people in, well, no worries, we just let them die out. Whereas on the other hand, if they're dynamic and entrepreneurial, they will succeed. So, but then that's a model of society. If we accept that as citizens, that our cities function that way, well, why not? But if we believe in equality amongst territories and cities, I think we need more structuring. And we were talking about this in the beginning. I think that the community intervention scale has limits. So the downtown actions, I think, give rise to a lot of questions about solving this problem. So I think that even one of the measures to be taken should be stop giving little cities urbanism skills. This has to be done at a higher administrative level. Maybe go back to breaking them out into counties or departments as we did in the past. There are pluses and minuses there, but you have to integrate urbanism, urban planning as something strategic and not something for consumption that promotes growth. But again, that's from a political standpoint and less scientific.
Sur cette position,
Well, everybody has a nuanced opinion. And in fact, we were coming to the end of our session. We've actually gone over the time for our session by several minutes. So we're going to bring it to a close, but please don't hesitate to have a chat with the presenters should you wish to do so during the coffee break. So thank you to our audience for their questions. Thank you very much to our speakers, and hope to see you soon. Goodbye.